So in this video, I'm going to share some tips and my own favorite recipe for chili. You can do this kind of chili on the stovetop or in the slow cooker, and there are lots of variations you could do. So you can use the recipe I offer here, or you can skip ahead because after the recipe, I offer some specific tips about things like seasonings and flavor. If you're going to make the recipe that's in this video, this is the list of things that you will need. Some of them are optional, but others are necessary. And you can make a meat variety or a meatless variety, and I will offer recommendations for amount of beans depending on how much you might need if you're using meat or not. And you can try some different things out and maybe have a different recipe than you've used in the past. So most of the time I use canned tomatoes to make my chili, canned diced tomatoes, and usually some tomato sauce and tomato paste, a plain canned tomato sauce. But this time I made it with fresh tomatoes because they're around in plenitude right now, locally and maybe even in your own garden. So if you want to do fresh, it does take a bit more time, but you probably are going to have a more nutritious chili because as soon as we can anything, especially things that are canned long-term for wide distribution, they tend to lose their nutrients. It's also tastier because you're using fresh ingredients that were picked at peak ripening, and there's no salt added. You can completely control the amount of table salt. You can, of course, get lower sodium varieties of canned tomatoes. And another option, if you want to think about the nutrition part, is sometimes you can find locally canned tomatoes at the farmers markets and even locally made tomato sauces. So that's another option. If it's been canned from local tomatoes, then that's a healthier option than just grabbing a can of whatever brand or generic label you get from the grocery store. These are the ingredients you'll need for my favorite chili recipe. You can omit certain things if you'd like, or you can use everything and give it a try and see what you think. I will say just a couple of things and you can maybe get a screenshot of this, or you can come back and pause this particular frame of the video while you prep everything and get it cooking. But what I will say is you don't need to use tomato sauce or tomato paste if you don't want to. It really depends on how thick you want your chili to be. A brothier chili does not have tomato sauce or tomato paste usually, or it might have just a little paste but no sauce. If you'd like a thick, hearty stew-like chili, then adding tomato sauce and tomato paste will help with that. This is the chili that I made, and I used fresh diced tomatoes, and with 4 cups, as the recipe calls for, I used 8 ounces of tomato sauce and 1 tablespoon of tomato paste. So you can see how thick this chili is. This is a nice stew consistency, which means I can just eat it plain, or I can do other things with it, as I will suggest later in this video. I'll say a couple of other quick things, and then I will move forward and share some tips about how to flavor your chili. The only other thing I would really say that actually has to do with flavor, but is about specifically Mexican oregano, which is what I use in my chili. You can skip the oregano completely. You can skip the basil completely. You can skip any of the greens, including a fresh green like cilantro or parsley at the end. It depends on what you like. Some people don't like specific kinds of greens like cilantro. If you use oregano, Mexican oregano probably complements the chili a bit more because Mexican oregano tends to have a kind of citrus undertone to it, whereas the Mediterranean kind of oregano, which is the typical kind that you're going to find in a grocery store if it's just labeled oregano, or it might be Italian, depending on the label, that's going to have more of a mint undertone, which may not complement the ingredients in this kind of chili as much. So it doesn't mean you can't use that kind of oregano in your chili if you want to give it a try. You can also just leave the oregano out. Not everybody puts oregano in their chili. One of the differences among different chilies is the kinds of spices. And of course, another difference is the amount of ingredients and kinds of ingredients sometimes. So this is my recipe, what I like, and when I make it. I used to make it with ground beef, and I have since moved into a vegetarian diet, and so instead I have increased the beans that I use. So instead of using a half pound of ground beef, I end up using either 2 cans of beans or 4 cups of cooked beans that were dry. But you can do what you want, and here are the directions once you've gathered your ingredients. If you do want to use fresh tomatoes, you do not need to peel them. If you really need to get the skins off, obviously wash and peel first before you chop up, but the skins really do cook up. So unless you really need to get the skins off because you're not allowed to eat them for some reason, then leaving them on is perfectly fine. I did not even notice when I made this batch of chili with fresh tomatoes that I left the skins on. So you can go ahead and just wash and take out that center part and then chop it, dice it into a small to medium sized amount. I can show you what it looks like here. So this is what my tomatoes looked like when I diced them up. They are fairly smally diced, and you can probably see that the skins are still on them, and then they cooked up really well when I cooked them for about an hour with all of the other ingredients. So if you want to have a very fine amount, then you can obviously just go ahead and use a food processor if you want, or if you just prefer to use the food processor and yours does a nice job of consistently. Mine does not really do a great job of consistently chopping into similar sizes. I'll end up with some that are pureed and others that are too chunky. So I prefer to just chop by hand, and it cooked up really well for me. And then obviously if you're using canned ingredients, you don't even need to worry about that. But once you have your tomatoes ready to go and all of your other ingredients gathered, then you just basically do like you do with a lot of other recipes, and you saute the onion and then add the garlic, and if you're using them, add the chilies, and then cook the meat and brown it if you're cooking meat. And I recommend that you drain the excess fat off. It's a little healthier that way. That's what I always used to do when I cooked it with ground beef. But you can do what you want. It's your choice if you're used to cooking with meat and prefer to keep. The fat does help to enhance the flavor, but if you're trying to keep the saturated fats under control, then removing some of that can help. And then you can either put everything back in the pot, or you can transfer it to a slow cooker crock pot if you want to do that, and just put all of the rest of the ingredients in and let it cook for about an hour if it's on the stove top, or 4 to 5 hours on high in a slow cooker, or about 8 to 10 hours on low. And then at the end, taste it, see if you need to add anything. You can adjust the seasonings at that point, and you'll be ready to go. And if you make it without meat, it actually can keep for a week or so in the fridge. Longer, you'd probably want to freeze it. If you're cooking it with meat, you probably want to freeze it after several days. So some things to think about as you are making your chili. One thing is if you are not using any fresh chilies because you're trying to keep the heat down, that's fine. One thing you might think about is that when you're using dry spices like chili powder, those are actually activated more when you cook them in the oil. This recipe, as many recipes do, calls for you to add those dry spices after everything has cooked when you're adding the tomato and other liquids. But you could actually put the chili powder right in the oil after you've cooked the garlic and the onion, and maybe before you add meat if you're cooking meat, because cooking it in the oil will help to activate it. So that will help to enhance the flavor, especially if you'd prefer a kind of mildly flavored heat-wise chili, but would like maybe a bit more flavor from the milder spices you're using. Some other things to think about if you are using chilies. If you find that some chilies you got are super hot, you can help yourself to keep the heat down. Obviously, you can just use a part of a chili. Washing them and freezing a piece of it is perfectly fine. Removing the seeds and the thickest parts of the insides will also help to reduce the heat. Another option is to put the entire washed chili into your batch of soup, and that will keep it from getting too hot because the hottest part, what's inside, will not get exposed directly to the rest of your ingredients. You can also soak them for about an hour in vinegar and cold water, and that will not only help to reduce the heat, it will also give some tanginess if you would like that, which can help to also enhance the flavor. So think about these kinds of things. And another thing to think about too is that if you do decide to use some chilies, some hot chilies, actually cooking them in the oil like this recipe calls for will change the capsaicin to something called vanillin, which is a natural ingredient found in vanilla and what gives vanilla its flavor. So that kind of sweet, but also somewhat floral flavor that you get from natural vanilla. You'll get just a little bit of a hint of that if you actually cook the chilies in oil first. That will help to activate the heat, but it will also give you that kind of sweet and floral flavor as well. So do what you want depending on what you like. If you really would prefer to avoid the heat, then you can skip the chilies altogether, no harm. Bell peppers can help to balance it out a little bit though, because they provide sweetness. They also provide nutrients and healthy colors to add to your chili. And the tomatoes themselves are also a natural flavor enhancer. So it's one of the reasons why chili is just so darn tasty is that it has a number of ingredients in it in its base that actually help to enhance the flavor of the spices that are used. So no matter what you do, you're going to end up with something tasty. It's just a matter of what you like the most. Regarding heat too, if you taste your chili and find out that it's actually hotter than you want it to be, there are some things that you can do to cool it down. Adding dairy is always helpful if you know that some people like it that hot, but others who are going to eat it don't. They can always, if they like, add cheese or sour cream. Those will help to reduce the heat. Sugar helps too if they're trying to avoid dairy. A little bit of plain sugar or honey added even just to individual servings or back into the whole pot, if you know that nobody's going to want it as hot as it is, will help to quell the heat. You can also just increase the other ingredients, obviously, until it gets to a point where you like, if you have enough ingredients to do that. But acids like vinegar, lemon juice, and lime juice also help. So you have some options depending on your diet and what you're trying to go for flavor-wise with your diet and the people that you're feeding. So how can you enjoy your chili besides just eating it? Well, if you like a brothy chili, then you probably want to eat it like a soup. And if you follow my recipe, which you end up with more of a stew, you can also just eat it like a soup. But you can also do other things with it when it gets thick. One thing that I like to do is to make a burrito and use that as the sauce instead of the usual burrito sauce. The chili is more variable in what I can do with it. So I usually end up making chili instead of making burrito sauce, and then I'll just defrost some chili when I'm ready to make a burrito. You could also just make a flatbread pizza similar to a burrito, but maybe instead of using a tortilla shell, you use a flatbread. And then you put the chili on and maybe some other ingredients if you'd like, such as corn. You can get fresh corn right now, so that would be great. Other toppings you might like, such as mushrooms and different things, and then sprinkle some cheese, dairy cheese or vegan cheese, and enjoy a pizza. You could make a rice bowl out of it or a burrito bowl out of it with that as a kind of sauce and some other burrito ingredients if you want to avoid the bread and do something like rice, especially a brown rice is going to be pretty healthy. And this is a picture, one of the things that I've said in one of my other videos that I made a while ago was that I like my burrito, instead of rice, I will skip the rice. And if I have some Brussels sprouts, I will just go ahead and put that in place of the rice. And it's really filling and it's more nutritious because Brussels sprouts are green. So they give you different kinds of nutrients, more kinds of nutrients than rice does. Rice is great because it's inexpensive. And if you do a brown rice, it's healthier because it's higher in the whole grains. But an even healthier option can be something like this if you like Brussels sprouts, and those will be in season probably in November, but you can get them in the grocery store too. So there are lots of things you can do with your chili. You can make it a lot of different ways, and you can use it in a lot of different things so that you can have a variety for your meals. I hope that there has been something helpful for you here and that you enjoy your chili.